A new typhoon approaches Taiwan just as the country cleans up from the last storm. Taiwan's cabinet signs off on new guidelines for using generative AI. Taiwan's elections are drawing closer, but which candidates have the best climate policy? Plus,
election season is kicking into gear in Taiwan, but why are temples must-go campaign stops for the country's candidates?
Warm welcome to TaiwanPlus News. I'm Philip Broussard. Typhoon Haikui is taking aim at Taiwan's north, just as the south of the country is cleaning up from Typhoon Saola. John Van Trieste has this update.
It's shaping up to be a rough weather week for East Asia, as a string of typhoons and tropical storms have been hammering the region. One of them, Typhoon Haikui, is headed towards Taiwan's north and could cut across the island.
这样子走，它的暴风圈有可能会比较接近我们的基隆北海岸地区，但是会不会接触到陆地？好，就是还要再看它未来它整个移动。
As the north prepares for this storm, the south is cleaning up after another. Typhoon Saola left widespread flooding in low-lying areas on a scale some people there say they haven't seen in years. Officials from a flooded part of Pingtung County say equipment for dealing with floods was of little use.
整个河体全部都满出来。
Saola is now heading towards Hong Kong. Schools, businesses, and the stock exchange there have been shut down in preparation. Joining these two storms is Tropical Storm Kirogi, now headed to Japan, so it could be several days before calm returns to the region. Scott Huang and John Van Trieste for TaiwanPlus.
The government could soon change a rule that some say discriminates against children adopted by same-sex couples. The adopted children of same-sex couples have the word adopted written on their national ID cards. This isn't required for children adopted by heterosexual couples. The government has approved a proposed amendment to end this practice. Some sitting and former lawmakers say the move would be good for both adopted children and families as a whole. Taiwan's cabinet has signed off on new rules restricting public servants from using generative artificial intelligence. Several countries have been mulling how to regulate fast-growing AI technology. Joyce Tseng has this report.
In the months since it was publicly launched, generative artificial intelligence has only been getting stronger. Rapid advances in AI have complicated government efforts around the world to regulate the technology, which is also true in Taiwan. For months, officials have been drafting rules to ensure three main things: that AI-generated information is correct, tools are used responsibly, and that digital infrastructure powering AI is secure. That's resulted in Taiwan's first set of rules for using machine-generated content in the public sector.
封闭式的地段的部署的生成式 AI 的模型呢，如果确认它这个系统环境的安全可以依机密等级呢来分级使用。
According to the guidelines, any AI-generated content by public offices, from the military to hospitals, must still be reviewed and approved by a human user. AI tools are not allowed to be used on confidential information. And in the interest of privacy, personal details are also banned from being fed into AI's data pool. Any public official using AI on a private network or VPN must also have this cleared first. And if AI is used at any point, that must be clearly labeled. Given the infinite ways generative AI can be applied, these rules are likely just a starting point.
我们希望在比较适当的这个资讯之下，我们才能够去往那个AI 基本法这个往下走。
Tech giants are betting artificial intelligence will revolutionize the way the world works. But concerns over a potential uncontrollable spread of disinformation and lack of transparency leave global leaders in a tight spot. As engineers explore new realms of AI capabilities, governments face the tough task of supporting innovation while protecting people from potential harm. And by releasing guidelines for public officials, Taiwan has taken its first step. James Lin and Joyce Tsen for TaiwanPlus.
Taipei Mayor Jiang Wan-an is back after his controversial trip to Shanghai. Jiang's visit with the mayor of the Chinese city was a moment of rare official communication across the strait. There have been no national government-level talks between China and Taiwan for the last 7 years. Zhang had previously said the annual Twin Cities Forum should only be held if China stops harassing Taiwan, but he maintains this trip will benefit both cities.
今年我们是第14届，能够把过去所打下的基础，所共同签署的45项备忘录，能够持续的深化。这一次的双城论坛，更重要，希望传达的意义是希望能够透过两座城市对话、沟通，务实的面对很多市政问题，而促进更多实质的合作，而能够符合民众的期待，都是希望两岸能够和平、稳定、繁荣。
Vietnam is the latest country to condemn a new map by China. The map shows Taiwan and the entire South China Sea as Chinese territory. The sea is one of the most disputed areas in the world. It's used by trade routes worth about $3 trillion a year. Taiwan, the Philippines, and India have also rejected the map, and some have filed diplomatic objections. Chinese officials say their map is based on historical documents, but did not say whether it represents official claims. 3 years ago, the Chinese government introduced legislation to its Inner Mongolia region, limiting the amount of school time dedicated to the Mongolian language. Now, a human rights group says the policy is expanding. Hughes reports.
This is Inner Mongolia, an autonomous region of China which borders the country Mongolia. About 20% of the population here identifies as ethnically Mongolian. There are very strong traditions built around the nomadic lifestyle. But under policies from the Chinese government, those have started to change. The latest is the expansion of the second-generation bilingual education. When introduced in 2020, the policy was only for 3 classes in Chinese during the school day, but not anymore.
9月1号，全区的这个所谓的这个民主语言授课的。
Which means all elementary and secondary schools must adhere to a national curriculum in the Chinese language, including classes in politics and history from Chinese government textbooks.
Under this policy, Chinese is the only language recognized as the national common language, without any formal amendment to its constitution. Madam Chair, the National Congress of China declared that the Mongolian language education is unconstitutional. Local authorities outlawed the use of Mongolian language entirely.
China's foreign ministry has always maintained that ethnic minorities' rights are protected in the Chinese constitution.
中国政府也根据有关的法律，在少数民族地区推广国家通用语言文字。
Similar bilingual policies have been introduced in Xinjiang and Tibet, affecting the Uyghur Muslims and Tibetans, where they've encountered pushback from local leaders.
I've always said we are not against multiculturalism. Multiculturalism is happening everywhere in the world. But one single majority population completely overwhelming a minority population, that amounts to cultural genocide.
For ethnic Mongolians, this is just the latest step in a long history of repression.
Mongolians realize that this is our last chance. Language is our last defense of national identity. So we lost our political rights. We lost our autonomy. And then now the traditional way of life is completely wiped out. And then, environment is destroyed. Now the language is the only symbol of Mongolian national identity. Now they are trying to take it away.
Every year, ethnic Mongolians in this part of China celebrate their heritage with a cultural festival. And for the people here, these traditions are a vital way to hold on to their identity, in the face of broadening policies from Beijing to enforce drastic changes to their daily lives. Alex Chen and Hughes for TaiwanPlus.
China's repression of its ethnic minorities is not limited to Inner Mongolia. In a report released 1 year ago, the United Nations said human rights abuses committed in the neighboring Xinjiang region amounted to crimes against humanity. To find out what's changed in the years since, Hughes spoke to Human Rights Watch China Director Sophie Richardson.
It has now been 1 year since the UN released the report about human rights abuses in the Xinjiang region of China. What has the follow-up been like?
At the time of the report's release, the then High Commissioner Michelle Bachelet was literally in her last day in the position. And when the new current High Commissioner Volker Turk took up the position later in 2022, he did say that there was no daylight between him and the report, that he considered it important, that he would take forward the recommendations, and was invested in talking with the Chinese government about how to make these improvements. Since that time, we've heard virtually nothing from his office about those discussions, about what's happening inside the region.
President Xi made a stop in the area just last week on his way home from the BRICS summit. What message was he trying to send?
It's hard to imagine that the timing of his visit is a coincidence. He had a significant delegation with him in the course of his speech. And so it's hard to see that this visit was not designed to try to preempt concern, both on the anniversary of the UN report and as we head into a stretch in which there should be heightened scrutiny of the Chinese government's policies at different UN human rights bodies.
Aside from scrutiny from the United Nations, what else can be done?
I think there's a foundational point, which is that the Chinese government has committed progressively worse abuses over the last several decades, in part because they haven't faced any serious consequences for having done so. And part of our message is that a failure to hold senior Chinese government officials accountable for crimes against humanity, to which, let's be clear, they're effectively publicly admitting, is to enable worse. And so if we don't want to find ourselves in a position 10 years down the track with even more serious or even more widespread atrocity crimes, it is imperative that governments take the kinds of steps that will deter these policies now.
That was Human Rights Watch China Director Sophie Richardson speaking to Harel Hughes. Coming up, a Japanese company has dreamed up a new way to take an afternoon nap. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching TaiwanPlus News. Japan's defense ministry is asking for a record-breaking $52 billion for military spending in 2024. That's a 12% increase over this year, with a large portion of that budget going to warships, missile defense, and counter-strike weapons. It's part of Japan's plan to double defense spending to 2% of the country's GDP by 2027 in reaction to perceived threats from China and North Korea. Earlier this year, Japan also announced it would deploy a missile defense unit on one of its islands just over 100 kilometers from Taiwan. For more on Japan's defense budget, our reporter Jaime Ocon spoke to Washington, D.C.-based security analyst Eleanor Hughes.
What is this motivation behind this increase in defense spending from Japan?
First of all, geographically speaking, Japan is surrounded by neighbors who, with little to no hesitation to exert instruments of powers in ways that are counter to Japan's security interests. And those powers are North Korea, Russia, and China. It's not a new phenomenon for China to exert its military powers in ways that are coercive, but I think a shock such as Russia's invasion of Ukraine really accelerated Japan's thinking to shift its security objectives as well as up its defense spending.
And with Japan now playing a more active role in spending more, not just on its own defense, but also working more closely with allies in the region like the United States and South Korea. What does this mean for security overall in the region? What do you think we're going to see in the next couple of years?
Well, Japan, unlike the past few, up until recently, I would say that Japan has less qualms to no longer keeping its head down. So in other words, being indifferent to these coercive behavior, whether it's from China, Russia, North Korea, or any other potential other actor in the area globally, might invite more coercion, if that makes sense. So the opportunity cost of not projecting deterrence could simply prolong the coercion that that Japan does not actually want to be prevalent in the region.
And we've seen announced a couple months before that Japan was debating about whether to deploy a missile defense system on Yonaguni Island, which is so close to Taiwan, only about 100 or so kilometers from Taiwan. How big of a factor do you think this uncertainty or this possibility of a potential conflict or even a blockade around Taiwan, how much of that is a motivating factor for Japan to up its defense spending?
I think that Taiwan, or the Taiwan Strait more broadly, as a geopolitical flashpoint and a potential site for a conflict down the line, is playing a greater role in shaping Tokyo's strategy in terms of where it wants to, what its security priorities are. In the annual defense white paper, for example, not only was Taiwan mentioned 20 times, although to be fair, part of it could have been because of like the amount of times Taiwan was mentioned in the graphics, but there was even a section that mentioned, Tokyo's intolerance for unilateral change in the status quo, which of course not only applies to Taiwan, but potentially in the East China Sea as well.
That was independent security analyst Eleanor Hughes speaking to our reporter, Jaime Okan. Thailand's King has reduced former Prime Minister Thaksin Shinawats' jail sentence. The billionaire businessman was set to serve 8 years for corruption and abuse of power, but that's now been brought down to just 1. Thaksin has been in prison since last week, when he made a dramatic return to Bangkok after 15 years in self-exile. His charges stem from crimes committed during his premiership, which ended in 2006 when he was toppled in a military coup. Thaksin arrived back in Thailand just as his former party returned to power. This has fueled speculation that he has struck a deal with Thailand's royal and military establishment. Thaksin denies those allegations. Back in Taiwan, the country's election season is in full swing. A central feature of campaigns is visits by candidates to the country's numerous temples. TaiwanPlus reporter Jeremy Olivier looks at how these sites have become such a big part of Taiwan's democratic politics.
This is presidential hopeful Lai Ching-te of Taiwan's ruling Democratic Progressive Party at a temple on the offshore island of Jinmen, which is nearest to China. And this is his main rival, Hou You-yi, of the opposition Kuomintang, or KMT, at another temple in Taiwan's capital city, Taipei. And this is Ko Wen-je, the third force contender from the Taiwan People's Party at yet another temple in southern Taiwan. Taiwan's political candidates regularly make these appearances on the campaign trail. When current President Tsai Ing-wen campaigned for the 2020 elections, she made over 130 temple visits, leading the KMT to criticize her as the temple president. But for people in Taiwan, it's an important part of the election process.
很多人会来啦，也有蓝的，也有绿的，也有白的，各方面大家会来看谁的政见比较好啊。
他除了来拜拜以外，这里是活动中心，人情聚集，在别的地方找不到这样理想的场地。
很重要啊，因为在台湾宗庙是最多的，比 7 还多。
Taiwan is home to both Eastern and Western religions, but most of the country's 12,000 or so temples are dedicated to Buddhism, Taoism, and Confucianism, and most often a local folk religion that combines elements of all three. And aside from praying here, particularly in small towns and villages, these places are the centers of the community.
They're always located in strategic locations, usually near a market or near a dock or a bridge or a transportation center. So they've always been sort of hubs of activity. And in a traditional village, one of the few places with an open space in front of it would be a temple.
There are also social clubs for local elites who frequently serve as the temple's management. This makes visiting them a must for political candidates, who can also use the opportunity to get some free advertising, make stump speeches, and pray for blessings from as many gods as possible.
So if you are a local elite or an aspiring politician, you definitely want to be associated with a temple because it is a public node associated with prestige and power.
There's also a hierarchy of which temples candidates should visit to rally voters. The Dajia Zhenlan Mazu Temple in Taichung is a main starting point for anyone looking to take office. The sea goddess Mazu is one of Taiwan's biggest deities and a favorite of the country's politicians, especially Foxconn founder and possible independent candidate Terry Guo. When he announced his first presidential run in 2019, Guo said Mazu had told him in a dream to do it. Other must-visit sites include the headquarters of Taiwan's 4 main Buddhist groups, Foguangshan, Ziji, Dharma Drum, Zhongtai Chan Monastery, and temples for a Chinese sect called Yiguan Dao. But mostly, it's pit stops at smaller local temples, like the one happening here, that are the norm in Taiwan. As candidates drum up support for their campaigns, and with elections set for January, voters can expect to see many more events like this one in the months ahead. Scott Huang and Jeremy Olivier in Taipei for TaiwanPlus.
With Taiwan's presidential election fast approaching, it's not just political analysts closely following the race, green groups are too. Sally Jensen has more.
In less than 140 days, the Taiwanese public will head to the polls, and for voters here, the climate is a high priority, with 60% saying it should be at the heart of presidential candidates' policies. Taiwan is no stranger to climate disasters, but it's also partly responsible as one of Asia's biggest per capita emitters of planet-warming greenhouse gases. Ahead of the election, environmentalists in the country have been scrutinizing candidates' green policies. NGO Greenpeace has released a report comparing the 3 main parties' climate and energy goals and say none of them are doing enough.
目前这3位候选人他在气候政策上都是不及格的，都是有待加强的。
Renewables like solar and wind currently make up around 10% of Taiwan's energy mix. Ruling Democratic Progressive Party candidate Lai Ching-te wants to push ahead with his party's goal of increasing that to 30% by 2030. Hou You-yi of the opposition Kuomintang wants to hit 27% by 2030. And Taiwan People's Party's Ko Wen-je has not explicitly set a renewables target for 2030. A fourth contender, billionaire founder of Foxconn Terry Guo, has also just thrown his hat into the ring. Greenpeace says they should all be aiming for at least 40%.
To get climate issues higher up on these candidates' agendas, Greenpeace is planning to hold a televised debate between presidential hopefuls in October. Besides more ambitious renewables targets, they also want candidates to make bigger commitments to reducing the country's emissions.
In line with international climate targets, Taiwan signed into law a 2050 net zero emissions goal early this year, despite the country's exclusion from the UN due to pressure from China, which refuses to see Taiwan as a sovereign nation. Now, Greenpeace Taiwan wants all candidates to set out their timelines on how they will achieve this. And as the country's existing climate and energy targets aim to boost its green credentials abroad, in the lead up to Election Day, environmentalists and the Taiwanese public will be watching to see if candidates are hitting the mark. Justin Wu and Sally Jensen for TaiwanPlus.
The police force has just gotten its first electronics detection dog. He's a black lab named Wafer and was donated by an organization in the US. Dogs like Wafer are used in other countries to sniff out hidden memory cards and other data storage devices. They can do this thanks to a chemical in the devices. These dogs have played an important role in several child predator cases overseas. Wafer is set to start sniffing for electronics in Taiwan after 2 weeks of training in the US. A cafe in Tokyo is home to the latest innovation in the world of afternoon naps. John Van Trieste takes a look.
They're calling them giraffe naps. These single-person booths set up in this Tokyo cafe let patrons sleep standing up, much like a giraffe. The pod's maker explains where the idea came from.
キリンはですね、1日だいたい20分ぐらい立って寝るみたいなんですよね。
そこから取って、仮眠もですね、1日20分ぐらいがちょうどいいということでですね、キリンの休息ということでジラフナップという名前にしました。
The pods have been drawing customers in for giraffe naps since they were installed in 2017. A half-hour kip costs just under $6. Nestle Japan, which owns the cafe, says they're good for customers' well-being.
どうしてもですね、横になって寝ていただくと、熟睡してしまって1時間2時間寝てしまって、夜の睡眠に悪い影響が出てしまうということがありまして、座って寝るスタイルを推奨しておりましたが、今回の自宅ナップであれば、立って寝ていただくので、20分の仮眠にすごく適しているというところで、弊社の方から声掛けさせていただきました。
To sleep standing up might not sound comfortable, but cushions support the legs and head, and there are plenty of happy customers.
立って寝る感覚初めてだったんですけど、体重が思ったより分散されてゆっくり寝ることができました。
腰とか、立ったまま辛いのかなと思ってたんですけれども、案外その辺に負担はかからなくて、本当によく考えられている、システムなんだなっていうのは感じました。
Helping to explain the pod's popularity is the fact that Japan is a sleep-deprived country. A 2021 OECD survey of 33 countries found Japanese people got the least sleep. That's why the company that makes them wants to stick its neck out further and sell them to Japan's offices and hospitals, spreading the sleep like a giraffe idea nationwide. Joseph Wu and John Van Trieste for TaiwanPlus.
Thank you for watching TaiwanPlus News. Finally today, we leave you with images from the Hot Air Balloon Festival in central Taiwan's Taichung City. I'm Philip Broussard. Take care and see you next time.